can work with that.
Let's start off with Reckless Greed.
Reckless Greed. That is a good example of a card that bad players probably can't play correctly. It's only really played in one deck right now, Dark Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
But...
Or Lavels. Lavels play it too.
Lavels play it too.
So if you play Reckless Greed at 1, is that... I mean, if you have one set and you play, is it bad?
It depends. It's like a huge debate. I've seen really good Dark World players who will set a Reckless Greed, and that's the only thing that they'll do. And somebody will go as far as, like, the dream scenario for Reckless Greed is for somebody to waste a piece of removal on it, right? Like an MST or a Heavy Storm. And that's, like, always a really... That's what you want. You love that. However, I've seen them in a lot of circumstances not even activated under those conditions. Like, they would just let it die, just let it be a 1-for-1, because that drawback of not being able to see your next 2 steps and you lose a card overall, can really hurt you. So yeah, a Reckless Greed is a tricky card to play correctly, isn't it?
And I've seen Yu-Gi-Oh players just play it for no particular reason.
Just for no reason, even if you already have or you don't have like much to work with and you're just using it desperately in the early stages of the game. That little concept applies to a lot of cards in general. People just playing it just to play it.
Like Torrential Tribute.
Torrential Tribute's another good example. I was just telling him a story about how I was playing on Dueling Network recently in the last couple games that I played. When I've been running in sectors, I'll summon a card trooper, turn 1, and they'll just torrential it for no apparent reason. Sometimes even with their own monster on the board that's not a floater, so I don't really understand this. These people have really high ratings, and we all know that Dueling Network players can be terrible, but that's a whole new level of terrible, I think.
That does happen. This one guy, all he needed to do was summon up. Well, he didn't need to summon a monster. He just needed to attack. But he summoned a monster, and I played Torrential, and he lost.
Yeah, that's one of those tricky things that can happen, especially when you're on the bubble of whatever big tournament you're at, maybe a regional or a local, and it's the game-winning thing. It's he has 1 back row and I have 1 monster on board. I can attack into D-Prison and possibly lose the game, or I can attack and just win the game right there, or I can summon in case he has D-Prison and then win the game that way. But does he have Torrential Tribute instead? And the answer a lot of the time is yes, they do have Torrential Tribute, and they're just trying to bluff you out.
So again, the purpose of this video is deciding when is the right time to use certain cards, but you really never absolutely know for a fact. It's always a guess.
Yeah.
Because they can always be bluffing.
Yeah, that's where one of the big aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! Above most other card games is reads, making reads. It's one of the huge things you have to do to be successful, and yeah, if it's a new back row that they just set on their last turn, there's some stuff you can do to figure it out. That's why you'll see a lot of better players checking their opponent's graveyard to see what they have left, what resources they might be able to use, and making a nice long read on a set back row over the course of a few turns. You can sort of fish it out, like figuring out what their back row is. If they have had 1 back row for the past 4 turns, maybe, or ever since the start of their first turn, and you've had cards that they could have activated Torrential Tribute on, or you'd expect them to, or even Mirror Force or something, and they don't, you can safely assume that it might be a card like MST if you haven't set a back row. That's one of the examples.
So, Alistair, when you have Torrential Tribute, what makes you want to activate it?
What makes me want to activate Torrential Tribute? I want to activate it for almost always a +1, so I want to trade my 1 Torrential Tribute for 2 of their monsters. In a lot of scenarios in the current game, it's not possible just because of how many monsters we have on the top decks that are what people refer to as floaters. These are monsters that either replace themselves with another card when they die, or just don't die at all, like Wind Up Rabbit being a perfect example. There are some scenarios where you have to even Torrential Tribute just floaters. Like I had a scenario yesterday when I was playing in a case tournament in Maryland. My opponent used a Venus to make Gachi Gachi Gentetsu, so that's a +1 right there. He has his 2000 attack Venus and a Gachi that doesn't die, and then next turn he summoned Card Trooper. So if I Torrential Tribute there, basically all I'm doing is saving myself from 4,300 damage, and he's not losing anything, and I'm definitely not gaining anything, and he gets a draw. So I had to Torrential there. That's not one of the scenarios that I like to do it, but in this current format, that's something that would set it off. Also, any kind of big wind-up push, any kind of almost any summon that the Mermail deck does and any summon that the Rabbit deck does, I'll Torrential Tribute on most of those things.
Here's another scenario. You have a set card.
Right.
And your opponent has 2 set cards. You draw.
A back row. A set back row. Okay.
You draw into a Mystical Space Typhoon.
Right.
Would you activate it?
No. One of my favorite things, and this is what separates a lot of the better players from the mediocre or even decent players, is, man, MST is at 3 right now, and people do side deck Dust Tornado as well, so when you're in that scenario, most of the decks that you could be running right now, you can do something tricky. You can you can summon a monster, see what they do. You gotta play around with them and fish out what they might have, so I'll summon my Thunder King. And people will ask me, like, you had MST in your hand, why didn't you just MST their back row so when they bottomless you, you would have hit the bottomless or something. I was like, well, I can't guarantee that I'm hitting bottomless, they could very well be MST. And especially, I think it's way more relevant when they have one back row, and I have one back row and I have MST. Because me personally, I'll love to set my MST when they already have a back row, just because I know that most players will go MST my back row, I'll chain my MST, hit their relevant card, and it's just downhill from there. So I like to get a feel for what my opponent has before I play my MSTs.
Dark Hole is another card that people activate prematurely.
Premature burially.
I remember
Jokes.
that this guy Dark Hole me one month. I'm like, okay, great. Next time I'm gonna summon everything I got.
Yeah.
You don't have Dark Hole now.
Exactly. Mass removal cards or any removal cards in general are used pretty sparingly by good players, and just as with the MSTs and the torrentials, you'll see the not so good players are the players that you never see doing well or terribly well. They'll just be, using them all. The same can even be said for Monster Reborn or anything, Heavy Storm as well. If you know your opponent's playing like a back row heavy deck, then it's not a good idea to just get that 1-for-1 heavy unless you're doing something that's very relevant, like Spirit Reaper, Magician Shark, any kind of like combo thing that you want to do. So yeah, all those cards, Darkhold especially. I know that I've been Darkhold many a time for nothing relevant, or I'll just set a monster and they'll Darkhold it for no reason, even though it could very well be Sengen. And that's one of the paradoxes of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is you get frustrated when people will do that bad play of turn 1 Darkholding your set monster, and it's something like a Mystic Tomato or maybe a Wind-Up Magician, and you're just like, damn, like, I wish I could have had the Sengen to punish them, but you just don't. And that's one of the things that stops players from getting better, because they don't get punished enough for their plays. It's a weird format for that, so, but yeah, it's in general.
So again, the purpose of this video was to realize staples, we were talking about staples mostly,
Staples.
that you just can't use them all willy-nilly.
Nope.
You just have to know, by learning, dueling people from experience, when to activate certain cards at what time.
Right, and as I've said with any of the mass removal cards, there's like a few cards that you have to look out for. Mainly bigger monsters that you can normal summon, like Thunder King or even Sabersaurus in some instances. I guess Kaiku being a side deck card in some decks, where it's okay to use your Torrential Tribute just for the 1-for-1 on those, or Mirror Force on the 1-for-1. Deep Prison is obviously a card you'd use in any scenario, but it's better most of the time to just hold back those cards and see how much value is the word that I like to use to get out of those powerful cards in your deck, to get the most out of them and tilt the duels in your favor.